I'm very delighted to be giving the Dean's Lecture series about my research program around how are regions involved in low carbon energy transitions. And before I get started, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships to the land continue to this day. So today I'd like to talk about energy transitions and climate change, just to give you a little bit of background context. I'll follow up with contextualizing renewable energy and addressing some of the myths out there about renewable energy. And then I'm going to talk about the role of regions and electrification. And I want to specifically talk about why would regions want to produce renewable energy for cities. And then I will give some examples of Indigenous leadership in renewable energy transitions. So, energy transitions and climate change. On the left-hand side of my screen, what you can see are gas, oil, and coal. And those are three fossil fuels that are responsible for the most greenhouse gas emissions globally. And in fact, globally, greenhouse gas emissions, 2/3 of them come from the energy sector, whereas in Canada, about 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from energy. And what you see on the right-hand side, it's a little bit of an old slide, but it does the trick. It's a scenario from the International Energy Association. And what it shows is how much the energy sector needs to grow out until 2040, and also how we will need to very dramatically and rapidly expand power sources such as nuclear, hydroelectric, wind, solar power, and other types of renewable energy. Those are all in the yellow, blue, and green at the top of the chart. And we'll need to expand those exponentially in order to replace fossil fuels and decarbonize our energy systems. And there's a lot at stake when we talk about having an energy transition which will mostly be renewable energy. And this is because it requires unprecedented investments in distribution systems and a new renewable energy supply. So for example, one estimate is that it will be about 22 trillion by 2050 investment, and another estimate is $125 trillion of new installed capacity in order to decarbonize our energy systems globally. And the spatial rollout of renewable energy has equity impacts and equity trade-offs between locations. And I'm really interested in that because I'm an energy geographer and I'm interested in how energy transitions are rolling out differently in different places. And so what I'm really interested in is how can we roll out renewable energy transitions equitably? But before we start talking about that, I would like to contextualize renewable energy and address a few myths that I suspect you may have heard. So to give a bit of context to renewable energy, what you can see in the images here, in the top image, this is what our traditional electricity system has looked like for about 100 years or more. On the left-hand side, we have generation, and that would be, for example, how we produce electricity from thermal power, nuclear, coal, renewable energy. And that electricity that's generated will go directly to a transmission line, which is a high voltage carrier of electricity. And then that will get stepped down to a lower voltage carrier of electricity called a distribution line. And then it will be shared with the demand side. So all the customers and consumers, like people living in houses or in residential buildings or businesses or the industrial sector. On the bottom image, what we see is what a transition for electricity is probably going to look like. And what we're going to have here at the top left, we'll have a supergrid, and that would be a high voltage line that's carrying electricity over very long distances. For example, it could be thousands of kilometers. We also have smart grids, which are new and they're digitally enabled electricity infrastructure. And on the right-hand side, what we have are what's called a microgrid. And the microgrid allows all of these new things like electric vehicles and solar power, what's called distributed generation, which is generation produced close to where it's used, different types of storage, and as well as having consumers who also produce renewable electricity, and they're called prosumers. So the transition is very different in terms of technology, but it's also going to be very different in terms of who is involved and how the electricity system is managed and governed. And so this transition is about decentralization and about bringing in new actors that are, for example, small and medium enterprises, citizens, municipalities, local authorities, and communities. And they will all have roles and responsibilities that will be very, very different than the traditional system at the top that was generally managed by a monopoly utility that did all of the roles in the electricity system. So there are challenges to decentralization. Renewable energy transitions are about technological, economic, and political decentralization. And this produces conflicts and compromises between the incumbent utilities and the new actors who are citizens and local governments and communities. And that's because renewable energy transitions are paradigm shift, and they require a really fundamental change to regulatory structures in order to procure and provide energy. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And this has created in most jurisdictions where I've spoken to people and that I've studied, it creates a power struggle between the incumbent utilities that need to change and embrace change and new actors who are trying to create change. So for example, Teen Vogue even reported on publicly owned utilities and how they could help fight the climate crisis. And this is a really big change for utilities who feel like they're going for a tumble and they're not really sure where they will land. So what are renewable energy technologies and innovations? So here's a little chart that I made myself, and we can see there's so many different types of innovations. So renewable energy innovations, they can include things like solar power, wind power, biomass, storage, demand response, which means changing how much electricity you use in response to some kind of stimulus, like maybe there's not enough electricity on the grid. It also means using things like heat pumps and combined heat and power, which dramatically actually increases the energy efficiency of a process. And it also includes waste heat recovery and what we call district heating and cooling. So here's a map of what waste heat recovery could look like. So in this case, these researchers mapped out the heat supply, and they also mapped out the cold supply, and they looked at heat demand and cold demand. And they said, you know, how could we match the, for example, excess heat from industrial processes to heat, say, buildings that are close by with their waste heat? And this is a really critical part of renewable energy, as I guess unsexy or uninteresting as it sounds. This chart gives a little bit more information on why waste heat is really important. This is a Sankey diagram of the sources of energy on the left-hand side and then the uses of energy on the right-hand side. And what we can see on the far right is a little orange piece that says useful energy. And then what we see beneath it are end-use losses and energy industry uses and losses. And what we can see in this chart is that the end-use losses, the losses of energy, are twice as large as the useful energy. And this is actually the case across any energy system. We tend to lose 2/3 of energy, and that energy is usually lost as waste heat. And that's why it's really, really critical that we learn how to harness waste heat and use it for heating processes so that we can replace fossil fuels like oil and natural gas that we might be using for heating processes. So I'm going to address a few myths about renewable energy. A lot of people want to know, is renewable energy market ready? And the answer is yes. According to the International Energy Agency, which is considered a fairly conservative body, they have an assessment of technology readiness, which you can see on the right-hand side. And we can see that the scale runs from 1 to 11. 1 is an initial idea, and 9, 10, and 11 mean that a technology is market ready, and 11 means that it's been proven, it's ready to go out on the market. However, just because a technology is market ready and proven doesn't mean that it's being adopted or taken up by society. And according to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, for example, they put out a report a few years ago that said that there are 38 renewable energy technologies that are market ready but are not diffusing or scaling, and that's due to lack of policy support. Some people might ask, is renewable energy not scaling because it's too expensive? And the answer is no. When I first started in this sector, renewable electricity was very expensive. Solar prices were above 80 cents per kilowatt hour Canadian. But the costs since then have fallen dramatically. And what we can see here in this image is that, for example, solar photovoltaic, the cost dropped by about 80%. For wind, they were dropping 26% year on year. These are massive, massive drops in cost. And recently, a study came out from Nature Energy, which is the top journal in my field, and it said that renewable energy is now cheaper than even coal. Can we rely on 100% renewable energy? And the answer is yes. This is a very, very early analysis that was done in 2017, and analyses since then have all confirmed that definitely in Canada we can rely on, we have enough potential renewable energy that we could rely on it across our entire economy. So on the left-hand side was current demand, and that was in 2010. And on the right-hand side was the potential of renewable energy. And what we can see is that there's far more renewable energy potential than demand in Canada. So it is entirely possible for us to have a 100% renewable electricity grid based on potential for generation. Can renewable energy generate revenue in Canada? And the answer is yes. So this image shows revenue from solar and wind electricity generation in Alberta from 2004 to 2022. And what we can see is that when we have generation weighted average revenue, so when we look at average revenue by different types of generation, solar is much higher than the average market, whereas wind is actually oftentimes a little bit lower. Can renewable energy systems be reliable? One of the myths we hear over and over again is that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and so we can't rely on renewable energy. And what engineers are showing through modeling and through demonstration right now is that they can be reliable with the right design and more investment in innovation and diffusion. And they can also be resilient to environmental hazards. So engineers are showing that by clustering diverse technologies and innovations and including participation of energy users, we can get closer to reliable energy systems. And what this image shows is that there's a microgrid, and this grid is trying to balance supply and demand at all times. And as we add more and more types of renewable energy technologies that are generating at different times, as we add more storage options and flexibility options like demand response, we have a lot of different resources to balance supply and demand, because we could use storage at certain points, we could use demand response, so ask people to use less electricity in a particular moment. And these are all methods that once we start to cluster and combine those options, we get closer and closer to a reliable electricity grid. But are we investing in innovation to find new materials for renewable energy? The image that I have at the top right is what I would call the innovation system. So anytime we have a new technology, it starts off in the research and development phase when scientists and engineers are developing a new technology. And once they have a kind of proof of concept, it can go to demonstration phase. We can have pilot demonstrations, pilot projects of these technologies. And then we start to figure out which markets these technologies can go into. And then we have the diffusion phase, which is where we try to bring that technology to as many parts of the market as we possibly can. So we try to have people purchase that technology and implement them. And that whole innovation system is influenced by policies, by networks of actors, and by the amount of funding that it gets. So when we want innovation, what we need to do is design policy and invest in research and development activities. And when we want diffusion, when we want that technology to go to market, we invest in and regulate deployment and diffusion. And what we can see in the bottom figures on both the left and the right side, the left side shows Canada and the right side shows globally, we can see that currently and historically, investment in fossil fuels has outpaced investment in renewable energy and in energy efficiency by orders of magnitude. So that means that, for example, sometimes we might invest 100 times in fossil fuels what we are investing in renewable energy. And that actually remains the case even until today in Canada and also globally. People also ask, what about critical mineral supply and human rights? And that's a really important question because a lot of extraction industries, mining and fossil fuel extraction, tend to be associated with human rights abuses in some areas. But what we can see on the map on the left is that there's more and more locations where these renewable energy supply chains are. There's different areas that could be supplying the market, and these are being monitored, but it could be that some of those areas have better practices than others, and we can favor those areas. On the right-hand side, though, is a new study that just came out, and what we can see here is that in the green, blue, and the green and blue in both charts, that's the mining that's associated with renewable energy economies. And in the gray, we can see mining associated with fossil fuel economies. And so what these researchers are arguing is that as we transition towards more renewable energy sources, the overall amount of extraction and mining reduces dramatically. So now I'd like to talk to you about regions and electrification. And this is what some of my research is about. On the right-hand side, I've got a chart from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it shows the amount of demand when we electrify transportation and heating. And what you can see on the far right is that there's an uptake or a growth in the amount of demand when we electrify those sectors of the economy. What I've learned is that in a net zero future, Canada's electricity generation capacity in 2050 would need to be 2 to 3 times bigger than it is today. So we would need to dramatically expand the size of our electricity system in order to electrify transportation and heating. In the US, under what they call medium and high scenarios by 2050, electricity consumption will increase by 20 to 38% compared to business as usual. And in all of these scenarios, this unprecedented absolute growth in annual electricity consumption can significantly alter supply-side infrastructure development requirements. What it means is that we will need a lot more electricity generation. And because the costs of renewable energy are so much lower than even coal now, it is most likely that we will have quite a bit of expansion and investment and implementation of renewable electricity. So let's go back to the geography of energy transitions. Cities account for over 2/3 of global carbon emissions and energy demand. So most of the energy that we use in society is used in cities. And by 2050, it's estimated that 68% of the world's population will live in urban areas. And this means that there will also be an increase in the types and uses of energy demand. So for example, for housing, for heating and cooling, for transportation, for industry. At the same time, cities occupy only 2% of the world's landmass. So they have a lot of people and a lot of energy uses in a very small area compared often to the regions that they occupy. So what we see is that over time, there's going to be growth of electricity in cities. Electricity in cities is growing a lot and will continue to grow a lot, and electricity demand for vehicles and heating is expected to expand electricity systems. And all of that growth, or most of that growth actually, will happen in cities. But let's look at where renewable energy supply is located. Here's a map of Canada in the middle, and we can see that the very dark points, the red and purple points, are highly populated areas. That's where we have all of our cities. And in the charts around the middle chart map of Canada, that documents where we have renewable energy potential. With renewable energy potential, the darker the color, the more potential there is. And what we can see just with looking at all of these charts is that the only type of renewable energy that really overlaps with high population is that of biomass. But the other types of renewable energy, like geothermal or solar or wind, often do not overlap with highly populated areas. This is one of my favorite charts, although it's a little bit hard to read. On the y-axis, going upwards vertically, we have power density, which is the amount of watts or the amount of energy that can be used or consumed in a certain area in square meters or square foot. And along the x-axis, which is the horizontal line, we can see the area in terms of just size, so square feet or square meters or square kilometers. And both of these charts are in logarithmic scale, which means that they go up by a multiplication factor. So they go from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 and so on. And I put circles around some of the things that are of interest. So on the right-hand side, we see cities. And we can see that cities have moderate power density on the chart because they're sort of in the middle from the top, but they're very large compared to energy technologies. But on the left-hand side of the chart, we can see things like solar water heaters, rooftop photovoltaics, and we also see houses. And what we can see is that there's not necessarily a clear overlap between the energy density of supply of, say, solar power and the energy density of demand of a city or of houses. And what that means is that we often need more renewable energy, more space for renewable energy to supply a smaller space of demand. And put in simple terms, if I were to put a solar panel on the rooftop of my house, I probably would not be able to rely solely on that electricity because it's not enough space to produce enough renewable electricity compared to what I'm consuming. And as we move up the chart, we can see the energy density of demand of high-rise buildings and of the world's tallest buildings and also of industrial sector. And what we can really see is that the renewable energy potential in terms of space is much, much lower. The renewable energy density is much, much lower than most of our energy consuming locations. And what that means is, again, if we were to supply high-rise buildings or industry with renewable energy, we would probably need a much, much larger footprint of renewable energy in order to supply those areas. Now, is it going to be that bad though? This is an analysis by Sarah Hastings-Simon of the University of Calgary. There were a lot of concerns about farmland that solar generation might take up as Alberta electrifies with renewable energy. And so they asked, how much farmland are we talking about potentially putting into the shadow of solar arrays? And so they calculated how much solar power they would need through 2041 to achieve net zero under a very renewable intensive scenario. And what they found was that only 0.08% of total agricultural land would be required. And if you look on the figure, It's that very, very tiny yellow dot on the right side. And so less than 0.1% of all agricultural land would be required to host a net zero solar future. So even though renewable energy requires more land than other forms of electricity generation, it still would be a very small amount of land when we, at least in Canada, because we have so much we have so many rural areas that we can rely on. Now I'd like to talk about how renewable energy supply is a regional issue. Energy and sustainability transition studies often focus on what's happening within spaces like specific states or communities rather than between spaces. And the analysis of the limits of renewable self-sufficiency of cities, so if we think about a city, can they be self-sufficient with renewable energy? And there's been very little analysis of this, but what we do have shows that they cannot be self-sufficient. And so some scholars are arguing that urban energy transitions are simply impossible without rural energy transitions. And so I've been arguing that when we think about energy transitions and decentralization, we need to include the interscalar relationships between cities, regions, and existing systems. And so what we can see on the right-hand side is, again, my little figure of the city inside the circle, and that's the city boundary. And on the outside is the rural area. And this is from a recent publication we had come out a couple years ago. So as I talked about already, as we electrify transportation and heating, and as cities continue to grow, there's going to be much, much more energy demand in cities, including electricity demand. But cities probably can't be self-sufficient. And what that means is that, and our analysis shows this, is that we will probably have to have a lot more renewable energy being generated in regions. And what this offers is an opportunity for regions to supply cities with electricity and for cities to pay for that electricity by generating new income for regions. But how this happens and how this comes about will have equity and justice implications. So I think a question we should all be asking ourselves is, why would regions want to produce renewable energy for cities? According to a meta-study, social acceptance of renewable energy is tied to control of decision-making and local benefits of renewable energy. On the right-hand side, I've got this chart, and it's about the process and the outcome. So what's the process for developing renewable energy, and what's the outcome? At the top, it says if the process is open participatory rather than closed and institutional, and if the outcome or the benefits are local and collective rather than distant and private, then we're probably more likely to have social acceptance of a project. However, whether this type of process comes about that's open and participatory, and whether or not communities get benefits from community-owned renewable energy is dependent on state actors and support. And the institutional structure, so the policies that are in place at the time, is an important factor in an institutional setting. So for example, some of you might have heard of the feed-in tariff law or the standard offer program that came about in Canada and in many different places. And those were what allowed renewable energy, community-owned renewable energy projects to proliferate in Canada. One of the issues that we come across is that there's been a lack of consistent documentation of the socioeconomic benefits of either local or networked communities, and that impedes our understanding of how to design effective policy to encourage social acceptance. And when I mean local, that means renewable energy for self-consumption, like in a remote community. And when I mean a networked community, I mean that they're grid connected and they may be selling electricity to the grid. So early studies have shown that local socioeconomic benefits for communities producing energy that they control can include economic development and revenue, renewable energy project acceptance, capacity development, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, socioeconomic regeneration, knowledge and skills development, social capital, energy literacy, and environmentally benign lifestyles, access to affordable energy, also empowerment. However, these are really, really early findings, and we haven't studied this consistently to see if these socioeconomic benefits are consistent across communities. So in terms of whether regions really do want to engage in renewable energy transitions, we looked at it from the other way in our study. We asked, are cities with ambitious plans for renewable energy planning to rely on regions? And we found 47 very ambitious renewable energy plans for cities. And we found that 24 of those 47 cities were explicitly taking regional approaches. And those are the plans that you see circled in orange. We found that some cities are reliant on the incumbent utilities or multi-state and national grids that may be privatized. And so that electricity transition is out of their control. But we found that many cities are really strongly participating in implementing renewable energy transitions through things like regional and district authorities, municipal ownership of utilities. For example, Los Angeles owns their own electricity utility. Some communities or cities are developing new relationships with surrounding communities, and some are combining centralized utilities approaches with regional approaches. In the last section of my talk, I'd like to talk about Indigenous leadership in regional renewable energy transitions. And this is what is happening right now in Canada. Many Indigenous communities in Canada right now are viewing renewable energy as an opportunity for local economic development and want to address looming supply crunches, and they want to lead the way in a renewable energy transition. And I would argue that indeed they are leading the way in a renewable energy transition. There are over 600 Indigenous communities in Canada that are Inuit, Métis, and First Nation. Indigenous peoples have been displaced and excluded by settler colonial infrastructures and institutions. So due to colonization, Indigenous communities face disparities and disadvantages in every conceivable indicator of well-being. And although they have different conceptions of what this means, reconciliation is about rebuilding relationships between settler and Indigenous people. What you can see in this map are all of the traditional lands of Indigenous people, which you can see covers the entire map of North America. The thing about community energy in settler colonialism and reconciliation is that settler colonialism structures the broader set of relations in which renewable energy projects are situated. And this is, for example, through the Constitution, the Indian Act, and a patchwork of treaties, unceded land, land claims, settlement agreements, and Indigenous communities' own legal orders and traditions. One of my former grad students who I wrote this paper with would remind me time and again, ultimately the Crown retains control through veto rights. So communities may never have absolute control over community renewable energy projects. What we wanted to study is if there's a relationship between community-owned renewable energy by Indigenous people and reconciliation. And in order to do that, we looked at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as indicated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Articles 26, 28, and 29 of UNDRIP outlines Indigenous peoples' rights to the control and development of the lands and territories to which they belong, including those confiscated resources, as well as the right to protect and conserve the environment, along with the importance of free, prior, and informed consent to any future activities that may take place on these lands. So my former graduate students wanted to find out, is renewable energy contributing to reconciliation? And what you can see in the map on the right are the number of projects that we found. This would have been in about 2017, 2018, in those provinces and territories in Canada. And so we found 194 projects with some form of Indigenous community involvement. And so we asked, are the projects on traditional land or on reserve or settlement land? Are they First Nation, Inuit, or Métis? And then we looked at how much control there was. And because we didn't run interviews, we did a survey. We effectively said that if there was equity ownership, that would denote control, whereas memorandum of understanding or a resource revenue or an impact and benefit agreements were indicators of weaker control. So we said that reconciliation was when there was equity ownership of projects on traditional lands. And so we asked that of the data set. And what we found was that oftentimes when a project was wholly Indigenous owned, there were 22, most of those projects were on reserves or settlements. And most of those projects were quite small. They might be a solar panel on a rooftop of a school or of a community center. On the right-hand side, we found traditional territory. We looked at the projects that were on traditional territory. And what we found was that there were 79 that either had minority or no ownership by Indigenous communities. And this is out of 194. And so overall, we found very, very few projects that were controlled by Indigenous communities on traditional land, which showed not too much indication of reconciliation. One thing to note, though, is that the timeline of a project typically could be 5 to 20 years. And so we only looked at projects that were active. We did not look at projects that were under development and the ownership structures and locations of those projects. So this is a historical look of what had happened. But we still asked, has this been improving over time? And we looked at different phases when Indigenous communities were consulted or recognized, when they started to be consulted and accommodated, and then some of the newer policies. And we still found that overall, if you look on this chart, the vast majority of projects have very little ownership by Indigenous communities, which shows that there's very little control over these projects. This is research that was done with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which is an organization that was established in 1984. It's a national pan-Indigenous member-based organization that's nonprofit and nonpartisan. Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business builds bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses and communities. They have over 2,200 members, and roughly 2/3 are Indigenous business. And they run several programs, including one that certifies that businesses are Indigenous. So this is some research that I did with another graduate student, Katarina Savic. And this is about how Indigenous economic development corporations are involved in renewable energy. And what I learned from working with Katarina and with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities are establishing what is called an economic development corporation. And at least 294 Indigenous economic development corporations are currently operating in Canada. These organizations exist across retail, forestry, fisheries, energy, mining, and construction, and hospitality sectors. And what I found really, really interesting about these organizations is that they are governed for community shareholders rather than for business shareholders. So these organizations are set up by the political organization, and they are governed by a board that reports to the community and to the political organization. And so Katarina wanted to know, what is their role in renewable energy? Indigenous economic development corporations are actually a very uniquely Indigenous business model. And what we found is that there were up to 26 Indigenous economic development corporations involved in 47 wind, solar, biomass, and hydroelectric projects. And these projects ranged in size from 0.5 to 230 megawatts, which is a very large project. Using the same data set that we had looked at before, what we found was that Indigenous economic development corporations more often tend to be involved in ownership of projects, such as partnerships and joint ventures, whereas the band council or the political organization is more often involved in something called a political governance structure, such as having a resource revenue sharing agreement or an impact and benefit agreement, which are often considered weaker. And so when we surveyed some of these Indigenous economic development corporations, We wanted to know about why they were interested in pursuing renewable energy. And so despite the stronger benefits of ownership, our findings show that Indigenous communities own few large renewable energy projects. And the interviews confirmed that not every community strives for whole ownership in renewable energy projects. And that's because they're concerned about the amount of money they would need to borrow to finance the projects. Some of the interviewees pointed out that the financial risk of greater project ownership may be too high for their community to take on. But despite that, they had quite a few motivations for pursuing renewable energy projects. And in order, in terms of the number of responses we got, the benefits that they shared was own source revenue, economic self-sufficiency, job creation, environmental reasons, autonomy and self-determination, knowledge and skills development, increased local support for renewable energy, energy literacy, government policies, social capital, access to affordable energy, empowerment, energy self-sufficiency, and transition off diesel. This is my final part of the talk. I want to talk about some recent research my lab is conducting with Clean Energy BC. And Clean Energy BC has been British Columbia's voice of independent power for over 25 years. They have 130 members that are independent and Indigenous producers, service companies, and academic institutions. And they have about 41 First Nations that are members of this organization. Clean Energy BC brought my lab into a research project funded by Natural Resources Canada called Capacity Development Research and Advocacy for Indigenous and Remote Clean Energy. And the other partner was the New Relationship Trust. And what they asked us to do was to interview First Nations in BC that already had renewable energy projects in order to understand the socioeconomic benefits of those projects. And so we conducted 20 interviews with 16 First Nation communities, 1 organization and 1 consultant. And we learned about 43 projects that were both planned and active. And we found that 12 of those projects, the community owned the majority of the project, so they had control over the project. 2 had less than 50% ownership, so they did not have control over the project, but they had ownership. And 7 projects had impact and benefit or revenue sharing agreements, so they had weaker control over those projects. What our findings show so far, and they're very preliminary, is that there were quite a few projects that ranged in size from about 20 megawatts to over 200 megawatts. And that's on the left-hand side. And most of those projects were hydroelectric, and there was 1 wind project. On the right-hand side, you can see that there were many solar and hydroelectric projects that were smaller than a megawatt all the way to the 8 megawatt size. So there were both large and small projects in our sample size. And what we did was we analyzed the preconditions of renewable energy. So for example, community engagement, the motivations of the community and the respondent, as well as impacts. And then we've looked at a huge range of benefit types, such as social cohesion and capital and a sense of pride. We looked for knowledge sharing. We looked for public infrastructure. We looked for learning, capacity building, and setting precedent, supply resilience, well-being and quality of life. We looked at socioeconomic regeneration, so things like employment, income, indirect flow on effects of revenue spending. We also looked for environmental benefits. We looked for autonomy, independence, self-determination, empowerment, and new imaginaries. We also looked if they were working with external networks and if there was education and awareness in external parties or visibility and influence. And finally, we looked at things like reconciliation and where project revenues were allocated. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but what we found was that there were a huge number of socioeconomic benefits associated with projects. We also found quite a few environmental benefits, and they weren't just greenhouse gas emissions, but they were even things like allowing the creation of fish channels. We found many benefits around reconciliation. So, for example, new and stronger relationships with BC Hydro, industry, and government, new conversations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, an increase in understanding and openness between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. There were many financial benefits that we found that were used in a variety of ways, but also these projects seem to bring a really strong sense of pride, increase in community confidence. These projects can support traditional values, and the community can become a good place to call home. We also learned that there were quite a few jobs that were created. And finally, we found that revenue allocation went to support quite a few programs in the community, for example, for youth and elders, and for different types of nature projects, and even to encourage members to attend community meetings through compensation. We're still putting together the analysis of these results, and we'll be happy to share them when they're ready. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to check out my website, socialexergy.com. You can also find me on Twitter, and I regularly post reports and publications on ResearchGate. Thanks for your attention.